Hello everybody, my name is Holly, and in this third and final webinar I am going to be taking you through the best and most effective ways in which you can engage with source analysis. So this webinar will probably be of most use to those of you who are about to take the history aptitude test in the next few weeks. I graduated from Pembroke College in 2018 with a degree in history. So a few years ago, I too was in the same position of being about to take the history aptitude test and engage in that unforeseen source analysis. Also, as a history undergraduate at Oxford, source analysis was a large part of the degree, whether that was as part of dissertation writing or as part of the work that forms weekly essays, particularly into second and third year. I also have a master's in history from the University of Manchester, and as part of my master's I also undertook a great deal of source analysis, not least for my master's dissertation. So I have a few kind of tips and ideas for you to implement in order for you to feel more confident and more at ease with the source analysis question. I think if you have done history GCSE or history A-level, or perhaps English literature or language GCSE and A-level, you will be used to some degree to engaging with source analysis. I think what is different for the history aptitude test and perhaps for studying history or related subjects at degree level is that sometimes the sources and the texts you will be grappling with are ones that you have never seen before, you have never approached before, and you need to be able to put them into context in a really kind of nebulous sense as well as to make sense of them. So I'm going to take you through some of the ways in which you can do so. Okay. Source analysis questions. So for the history aptitude test, you will be asked to engage with a text that you are very unlikely to have seen before. This is purposeful. It means that everybody sitting the exam is very, very likely to go in on a level playing field. There isn't any specific information or facts or content that you can revise that's really going to help you in this regard. In fact, with the history aptitude test, if you do include information that you knew prior to the exam, you won't be awarded on it. Again, no prior knowledge is necessary, and this is really an opportunity to test your originality and creativity of thinking. In many ways, the source analysis, it probably doesn't seem so at the time because no exam is particularly fun or enjoyable, but it's one of the more fun or enjoyable tasks that you can be asked to do as part of an exam. The texts that you would be, or the text that you would be asked to respond on, is likely to be really interesting, is likely to be really engaging. It's been chosen for a reason. There's loads of different things that you can do with it and loads of different avenues you can go down with it. And in that sense, I think sometimes candidates find it quite overwhelming to know where to begin. So what we're going to do throughout this webinar is go through an example history aptitude source and look at the different ways in which it could be approached and structured so that your written answer properly conveys all of the brilliant ideas that you will no doubt have come up with just through looking at the source. Again, so this is of particular relevance to the history aptitude test, but if you are sitting an admissions test for English literature and language or for modern languages, you would also be expected to engage with a source. I think for modern languages that would probably only be relevant if you were sitting for joint schools with philosophy, but in that case this webinar may be of some use to you in practicing those skills and thinking about the different ways in which you can approach sources. There are no wrong answers with the source analysis question, and this perhaps feeds back into the idea that this isn't a completely unenjoyable task. There are loads of different directions in which you can take it. You can be really creative and original and show academic flair, but within that you need to make sure that you keep your answers structured and really tightly focused, and that is something we're going to be talking about throughout this webinar. There is no point kind of sitting down after you've really looked at the source and come up with really amazing ideas and things that you want to talk about, sitting down and then kind of regurgitating all of that information onto a page and it's not structured, it's not focused, and it doesn't answer the question, because your ideas may be excellent, but you won't get any credit for it because that's not exactly the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to take those brilliant ideas and show that you can apply them to answer a really specific question that's being asked. And the question that will be posed to you as part of that source analysis is likely to be a broad one, so that you can take loads of these ideas and really kind of show them off and elucidate them, but it still needs to be a tightly focused answer, as that is what you would be expected to do at kind of undergraduate level and beyond also. What I have here is an example. I'm going to minimize my camera now so that you can see the full screen once I click through. This is the source that was used for the history aptitude test last year. It is a letter from a Sri Lankan king to a Portuguese king in the 16th century. If I had encountered this as my history aptitude test, I would have had absolutely no prior knowledge about it. It's not an area that I'd ever looked at. It's not a time period that I'd engaged with as part of my A-level history. And it's very much unlikely that any other candidate would have a significant amount of knowledge based on it. Okay, so it's level playing field for everybody. So this is, the actual source is 2 pages, but for the purposes of this presentation, I've just condensed it to the first page. What I would do then is you get into your history aptitude test, you turn the page, you see this. I would just read through it once. You will have an hour to respond, which is actually quite a bit of time. So I would familiarize myself with the text, read through it, getting an idea of kind of what the text is about, who the main players are in it, and kind of the different directions and themes that you may be able to pick up upon as part of your response. After you have done a read through once, I would then annotate. So I would read back through it again, but this time do it really actively so that you're annotating any points of interest that come up to you. So for the purposes of this presentation, I've kind of done that. You would no doubt have much more on your page. It would be absolutely covered in writings and annotations and circles and things like that. But just for the purposes of this example, these are a couple of things that I noted down as I read through. So the best way in which to do this, circle absolutely anything that you think could be of interest, make a little note to yourself as to why you think it could be of interest. And as you can see with many of these annotations, they're just a few words. But you never know what will be relevant when you come to actually write your answer. So if you're reading back through it a second time and you think, that makes me think of XYZ, or this is interesting for XYZ reason, circle it, make a note of it, and you can come back to it. So your 2 pages in this case would be absolutely covered with all of the various things that you think could potentially be interesting. Think of yourself as being like a detective and you're looking for clues and you don't know yet what those clues will help you to solve, but you know that they could be of interest further down the line. Once you've gone through your text for the second time, you've annotated absolutely everything that you can think of or think of that could be interesting, then go back through your points and group them thematically. This is perhaps the most crucial part of the planning process because this is what is going to structure your actual response. So you would have at this point loads of different annotations, circles, notes. They don't really mean anything on their own. They're a bit all over the place. They're not structured. They're not organized in any real sense. What you will now do is do that, structure them. So you would have a look at some of these annotations, see if you can identify similarities or perhaps links or connections or overarching themes in any of them that could be useful, and make a note of what those themes could be. So having looked at the annotations that I made and the points that I came up with, I thought that there were 3 main themes. Those were 1, unequal power relations, 2, disagreement over trade, and 3, religious differences. And the question that I would be, or that the history aptitude test kind of directed that I answer in relation to this text, was on the nature of the relationship between the 2 kings, who the letter is between, or between, I think it's internal Portuguese relations. So these 3 themes here are ways in which I can directly answer that question. So I've got my main 3 themes here. This is not to say that you would only have 3 themes. As I've said, 1 hour is actually quite a significant bit of time in which to craft this answer. but I have come up with 3 themes. I would then go back through my annotations and number each note by the theme it is relevant to. So to show you what I mean by this. So I have here a show of power, unequal power relations, number 1. Number 2, disagreement over trade that I've kind of linked in here, should pay what is due. 3, religious differences. You may see with some of them that I've put 1/2. Some of them may fit into more than one theme, and that's completely fine. Once I've done that, I would be ready to plan my answer. So it may be that with all of your annotations, you don't use all of them, or there are some that on reflection, you don't think are as relevant as you initially thought. And again, that is completely fine. You need to be using the most pertinent and the most interesting examples that you can find in the source. The majority of them probably will be numbered in relation to some of the themes that you've identified, but it's fine if not all of them are. So I would then sit down to plan your answer, and I would do it under the main themes that you have identified. So for the purposes of this example, we've got 3. 1, unequal power relations. 2, disagreement over trade. 3, religious differences. So I would almost kind of make those into 3 separate charts, and I would identify within that chart the points or the pieces of evidence that you definitely want to deploy in order to demonstrate those themes, or in order to kind of really show that you think they are of importance and of relevance. Just because this is a source analysis rather than a kind of traditional argument crafted essay doesn't mean that you don't need an introduction. So you need an introduction to set up what exactly it is you're going to do in your response and the themes that you're going to be looking at. There is, however, no need for a conclusion. I'm going to kind of show you what a source analysis response would look like in terms of structure. But in essence, you would have your introduction, your thematic paragraphs, and you don't really need a conclusion to bring it all together. This isn't really a traditional essay in perhaps the same vein as one you would write for A-level or IB, or as part of OxNet would be. It's more of a response. Don't forget the rubric when you are planning your essay and when you're coming up with your evidence and the points that you think are of relevance to deploy. What I mean by the rubric is this here on the left of the slide. This will be the preface to any text that you are set as part of something such as the history aptitude test. I think sometimes some candidates can dismiss this as irrelevant or just some kind of contextual information that doesn't really bear any importance or relevance in itself. In fact, you should annotate and number this in the same way as you do for the main textual source, because this can provide really crucial provenance and contextual information that is absolutely integral to your response. If you want to show your kind of prowess as an academic historian, you need to demonstrate awareness of the provenance of the source. I'm sure that's a term that you've come across through GCSE or A-level history, but provenance is basically showing what kind of the significance of the text is and that awareness of the contextual information. So for instance, the rubric of this particular source contains information about who the 2 kings are, what their relationship is, some contextual information about the religion of Sri Lanka and Portugal, which is completely directly relevant to the 3rd thematic point that I identified there, which is religious difference. Annotate and number it in the same way and draw on it and integrate it into your answer as much as the textual analysis. When I talk about provenance, it's asking yourself questions such as who wrote it and when, and how could this affect the nature of the source. There is a mark scheme for this history aptitude test, as with all history aptitude tests, that is readily available online along with all of the past papers. In those mark schemes, you will see that a lot of the indicative content draws a lot from the contextual information contained in the rubric. So it is still something that admissions tutors are expecting to see in your answer. So don't dismiss this initial piece of information as something that you don't need to engage with past it giving you contextual information. Actually, it's really key to the themes that you would be exploring as part of your written response. Okay, how to structure your source analysis question. As we've kind of touched upon there, it's slightly different to an essay response where you would have your introduction, which is your main argument, and then you would prove your argument through perhaps 2 or 3 points in the main body of your essay, using examples and evidence to justify that, and then your conclusion, which really cyclically brings it all together, summarizes, and kind of polishes off the essay. A source analysis response for something like a history aptitude test won't be structured the same way because it isn't the same kind of writing. So instead, it's less about crafting a single argument, but identifying factors and themes. You're taking a thematic approach to this response. So you would still have an introduction right at the beginning of your response that sets out the kinds of themes that you're going to be looking at, but then the paragraphs would flow quite thematically and they would be quite rigidly structured in that sense. Again, a short introduction. So this would detail how you're going to look at unequal power relations, disagreement over trade, and religious differences. Those are the 3 that I identified. It may be that you look at that source and you come up with a completely different set of themes, and that's absolutely fine. And in fact, that should be the case for an academic source analysis. But that short introduction just sets out those themes that I'm going to look at, and it organizes and structures my argument so that it's not just a kind of regurgitation onto the page of the various different things that I've identified as part of my annotations. It shows that even though it's a source analysis, as a historian or a prospective student of history at a top university like Oxford, you are still able to structure your response and really analytically and clearly and with nuance express how you're going to approach this complex question. We're taking a thematic approach. We've kind of talked about this. So with an essay that's centered around an argument, you would have 3 points which logically flow on from each other and which prove the argument. In this regard, you would perhaps have 3 or more paragraphs that are grouped together by theme, and you would use all of your evidence and your examples that you've encountered as part of your annotation and your planning in order to really elucidate and enhance your discussion of that theme, but it doesn't have to as logically flow on from the prior point as it would do in an essay that's based on advancing an argument. Tips for writing: you must include direct quotes in your source analysis response. So some examples here of how the king, quote, begs your highness, unquote, for the right to sell the excess cinnamon. And then you could say, this illuminates the unequal nature of their relationship through showing that, ... Or another example is the fact that the king talks of, quote unquote, due compensation to be paid to slave owners suggests that. And what I'm kind of hoping to show you through these examples is that you're using the direct quotes in an integrated way to enhance your argument. You're not just throwing them in and not engaging with them. In fact, you're using them as your evidence and showing that you've engaged with the source, but that you've also thought about it, and that these quotes actually prove something that you are setting out to show as part of that thematic paragraph. So don't just throw quotes in for no reason. If you use a quote, and you should be using quotes throughout, you're using it as evidence, and you're using it in a really thoughtful way to explain the points that you've come up with. Keep focused and ensure that you are answering the question. There can be a tendency with source analysis questions to kind of go off on a bit of a tangent because it's such a, it's probably quite a different task to what you would be used to be doing as part of an A-level essay or an IB essay or an OxNet essay. It doesn't mean, however, that you can just go off on your own tangent and you lose track of all of those structural and analytical tips and advice that we've given you. And you need to remain really clearly focused. You need to keep the question you are answering at the forefront of your mind. And each time you write a sentence or you come to the end of a paragraph, you need to ensure that you are checking that it directly answers the question and that you haven't instead started talking about things that you find interesting or more engaging, but instead you have focused really, really clearly and tightly on answering the question posed, because that is the only way in which you will be able to access the top marks. If you are making really interesting and engaging and thoughtful and nuanced points, but you're doing so in order to answer the question. You're not just using the question as a way in which to go off in another direction, because that's not the point of the test. And that's not the point of source analysis in general. If you were to get onto kind of higher level academic study, so whether that's through writing an undergraduate dissertation or a master's dissertation or at PhD level, this source analysis and the sources that you would encounter through going to archives or accessing things online, the analysis that you would take away from your work on that would be to enhance your argument rather than shoehorn a source in just because you think it's interesting or you think it's engaging or you think it would make for a good read. In fact, you're using that source and that analysis in order to show or prove your own argument. And that's always in relation to a specific question. Do not focus on being right or wrong. I think this can be quite a difficult concept to master as part of source analysis. The reality with a lot of these sources, and probably in particular the ones that will be set for you as part of the history aptitude test, is that nobody really knows. All you can really do at this stage, you only have a limited amount of information, is make the best inferences that you can. What this often comes down to is something known as educated guesswork. The key word in that is educated, because you're using evidence and examples in order to make your point. But admissions tutors and the people who mark these exams are aware that you know next to nothing about the context in which it has been made, about the period in which it has been made, and instead you're kind of making the best argument that you can based on the limited information that you have. So do not focus on being right or wrong. If there is something that you find particularly interesting, make a point out of it. But if you are too focused on making a right answer, it will hold the quality of your overall work back. Think about what is not included in the source as much as what is. So for instance, in that source, there is a lot of talk of how the Sri Lankan king is asking the Portuguese king to issue decrees. But to what extent were those decrees actually enacted in practice? There are as many clues in the source about things that go unsaid as there are about things that are really explicitly said. And that is quite a sophisticated and nuanced thing to pick up upon. I wouldn't make something like that the center point of your response, and it should always be evidence-led and kind of quote-led. But sometimes it may be that you engage with a particular sentence or a particular quote from the source, and it makes you think about something that is not included. And that is absolutely fine to include as well. It shows that you're thinking in a big picture. It shows that you're thinking independently and originally, and it may throw up something that the person marking it hasn't thought about before either. So don't be afraid to take that avenue also. Again, I've said it before, you need to ensure that you plan properly. Although this is different from a traditional essay, you need to make sure that you are planning in much the same way. My final conclusion for source analysis responses and for things such as the history aptitude test is to enjoy it. It is a different kind of response than an essay one. In many respects, it's much more enjoyable. You're engaging with something that you haven't encountered before, you're learning from it, and it's an exercise that really allows for originality and independence of thinking. So don't be intimidated by it. Look at the past papers online, familiarize yourself with the structure and layout of the exam, and practice those things such as annotating interesting points, thinking really fully and thoughtfully about kind of things that you could infer from or things that perhaps aren't obvious points. Practice kind of categorizing those annotations thematically and planning out your response as well as writing your response. The more that you practice these kinds of questions using some of those tips and processes that we've talked about in this webinar, the better you will get. And actually, once you kind of sit it or you come away from a really interesting source, I think 99.999% of the time it will be an experience that you have enjoyed and that you've learned something from.